Hello, boys and girls. This is going to be reading, and today we're going to talk about some things that we're going to find in our books. We're going to talk about characters, we're going to talk about the setting, and we're going to talk about the main ideas. Those are the important things that happen in the book. Make sure you pay attention. You know characters and settings, you know what those things are. So, today we're going to read Make Way for Ducklings. And it is a Caldecott Honor Book. That is an award for the illustrations. Okay? It's called Make Way for Ducklings. Now, usually I have to put on my magic reading glasses, but today I have my magic seeing far away glasses on, so I have to take these off to be able to read. Make Way for Ducklings by Robert McCloskey. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live, but every time Mr. Mallard saw what looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. They were sure to be foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family where there might be foxes or turtles. So they flew on and on. When they get to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further. There was a nice pond in the public garden with a little island on it. The very place to spend the night, quacked Mrs. Mallard. So down they flew. It's a pretty picture right there. Next morning they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond, but they didn't find much. Just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a strange, enormous bird came by. It was pushing a boat full of people. There was a man sitting on its back. "Good morning," quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. The big bird was too proud to answer, but the people in the boat threw peanuts into the water, so the Mallards followed them all around the pond and got another breakfast better than the first. And this book was written a long time ago, so you can see how the people are dressed. Notice that every man is wearing a hat. Every lady is wearing a hat. People used to wear hats all of the time, and not baseball caps either. "I like this place," said Mrs. Mallard as they climbed out on the bank and waddled along. "Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right on this pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. What could be better?" "Good," said Mr. Mallard, delighted, and at last Mrs. Mallard had found a place that suited her. But "Look out!" squawked Mrs. Mallard, all of a dither. "You'll get run over." And when she got her breath, she added, "This is no place for babies. With all these horrid things rushing about, we'll have to look somewhere else." So they flew over Beacon Hill and round the State House, but there was no place. They looked in Louisburg Square, but there was no water to swim in. They flew over the Charles River. "This is better," quacked Mr. Mallard. "That island looks like a nice quiet place, and it's only a little way from the public garden." "Yes," said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts. "That looks just like the right place to hatch ducklings." So you can see they're right by a river. The setting, right by a river. Look how pretty. So they chose a quiet spot among the bushes near the water and settled down to build their nest. And only just in time, for now they were beginning to molt. What does molt mean? See if you can find out what molt means. All their wing feathers started to drop out, and they would not be able to fly again until the new ones grew in. Sounds like we might know what molt means now. But of course they could swim, and one day they swam over to the park on the river bank, and there they met a policeman called Michael. Michael fed them peanuts, and after that the Mallards called on Michael every day. Michael? Michael's a policeman. After Mrs. Mallard had laid 8 eggs in the nest, she couldn't go to visit Michael anymore because she had to sit on the eggs to keep them warm. She moved off the nest only to get a drink of water or to have her lunch or to count the eggs to make sure they were all there. One day the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, then Cack, and then Lack and Mack and Knack and Quack and Pack and Whack. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great responsibility taking care of so many ducklings, and it kept them very busy. One thing I notice about all these words, every name that they name their little ducklings rhyme, and they all end with CK, the digraph. Aren't they cute? Right now, I'm really missing our classroom because if we were in our classroom right now, we would see the mommy and daddy mallard right in the pond outside our window, and the baby ducks would be hatching very soon. We had the best classroom, didn't we? We would take turns standing on the chair to look out the windows, and right now the ducklings would be there. One day, Mr. Mallard decided he'd like to take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like further on. So off he set. "I'll meet you in a week in the public garden," he quacked over his shoulder. "Take good care of the ducklings." "Don't worry," said Mrs. Mallard. "I know all about bringing up children." And she did. She taught them how to swim and dive. She taught them to walk in a line, to come when they were called, and to keep a safe distance from bikes and scooters and other things with wheels. When at last she felt perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come along, children, follow me." Before you could wink an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack fell into line, just as they had been taught. Mrs. Mallard led the way into the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. Isn't that cute? Look at all them. There they waded ashore and waddled along till they came to a highway. Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross the road. "Honk, honk," went the horns on the speeding cars. "Quack," went Mrs. Mallard as she tumbled back again. "Quack, quack, quack, quack," went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack, just as loud as the little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on quack, quack, quacking. And if you notice, look at those cars. They don't look like cars of today. That's how old this book is. They made such a noise that Michael came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistle. Tweet, tweet! He planted himself in the center of the road, raised one hand to stop the traffic, and then beckoned with the other, the way policemen do, for Mrs. Mallard to cross over. As soon as Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings were safe on the other side and on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to his police booth. Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookshop and turned into Charles Street with Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack all marching in line behind her. Everyone stared. The old lady from Beacon Hill said, "Isn't it amazing?" And the man who swept the street said, "Well, now, ain't that nice?" And when Mrs. Mallard heard them, she was so proud she tipped her nose in the air and walked along with an extra swing in her waddle. When they came to the corner of Beacon Street, the police car with the 4 policemen and that Clancy had sent from the headquarters. The policemen held back the traffic so Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings could march across the street. There they are, marching across. Right on into the public garden. Inside the gate, they all turned around to say thank you to the policemen. The policemen smiled and waved goodbye. When they reached the pond and swam across to the little island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them just as he had promised. The ducklings liked the new island so much that they decided to live there. All day long they followed the swan boats and eat peanuts. And when night falls, they swim to their little island and go to sleep. The end. Okay, good job listening, boys and girls. Okay, so the characters in the story. I'll look right on the front. The characters are Mr. and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings. There's one other character that is in here that shows up a lot. Can anyone think of it? Yep, Michael. He's another character. Okay, the setting. Think about the setting. Where does it take place? Well, I'll tell you, it takes place in a city called Boston. You can say near the water. You can say in the park, because it all happened in those places. Today, if you get a chance, I want you to see if you can Google the real park in Boston where these ducks, they actually have statues of the baby ducks there. It's kind of cool. See if you can find it. And if you find it, take a picture and send it to me on my Facebook page or on here. You can even say the setting, part of the setting was right here on the street. Right? Okay. So what about important events? The main events in the story. Well, I think one of the very important things was first that happened was the mom and the dad, Mallard, were looking for a place to make their nest. They found a couple places they didn't really like, and then they found a wonderful place near the river. The eggs hatched. That's very important. And then Mrs. Mallard taught them to swim and dive. And then she walked them to the park to find Mr. Mallard. And in the end, they decided to live right on that island in the middle of the park. Right there. Those are all the main parts of the story. Today, boys and girls, when you read, I want you to see if you can find characters, settings, and the main events that happen in the story. All right? Don't forget, if you can find out the pictures of the statues of the ducks, that would be awesome. Okay, see you a little bit later.